Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about how to get the most performance out of your radio link. So if you're familiar with the drone community, you may see a lot of hype surrounding the latest and greatest transmitters and radio protocols with lower latency, more range, more features, etc. Furthermore, if you are new to the drone community and have come from the fixed wing community, you may have noticed that the transmitters that are popular for drone pilots are slightly different than what's popular for fixed wing pilots. And this may lead you to believe that you need to upgrade to the latest and greatest transmitter to make sure you're not getting held back or something like that. And I'm gonna tell you and also myself that the best transmitter is the transmitter that you already own. So this is the transmitter that I own. You may have seen it in my FPV trick theory videos. Make sure to go watch those. This is the first generation Spektrum DX8. It is over 10 years old at this point. It is an absolute dinosaur, but it gets the job done. Does it have the lowest latency? No. Does it have the best range? No. But for 99% of pilots out there, the half-decent transmitter that you already own has low enough latency and good enough range that it is not going to hold you back, it is not going to be noticeably bad, and it's still going to allow you to progress your skills and have fun, which is kind of the whole point of flying drones. With that said, there are some things you can do to make sure you're getting the most performance out of what you already own, which is the focus of this video. This video is also going to be catered more towards Spektrum users because I fly Spektrum and Spektrum users do not get a lot of love in the drone community. So today I'm going to give you guys some love and basically give you a full-blown tutorial of how to set up your drone, bind your receiver, set up all the Betaflight settings and the certain parameters and radio settings you want to pay attention to. With that being said, there will be plenty of non-Spektrum specific content in this video, so make sure you stick around and maybe you'll learn a thing or two. Proper antenna placement is arguably more important than whatever fancy smancy protocol you're using. First thing to know is you're probably flying a drone that is made out of carbon fiber, and carbon fiber is awesome because it's super strong, it's super light, but it's also electrically conductive, which means it will block radio signals. The first tip about antenna placement is make sure you have your antennas away from your carbon fiber frame. So the way I mount my antennas is I zip tie another zip tie to this rear standoffs, and then I heat shrink the antenna to that zip tie, and that gets it far away from all the carbon fiber bits. I have seen people put antennas directly on the bottom of arms. That is not a good idea. If you have them sticking out like this, that's totally fine. The next tip is if you're using a diversity receiver, which you should, you want to make sure your antennas are oriented 90 degrees apart. This makes sure their orientation is very different so that if one antenna has bad signal, more likely than not, the other antenna is going to have good signal and you will avoid a failsafe and you'll have good radio communication. Next tip is to make sure that your video transmitter antenna has some separation to your receiver antennas. Yes, your video transmitter is on a different frequency than your receiver, but especially for cheaper video transmitters, they will bleed all over the place and you generally just don't want your video transmitter shouting into your receiver. It's not good for your reception. So try to get some separation. Lastly, similarly to carbon fiber, your battery leads are conductive, so they can also block your radio signal. And it's very popular to route your battery leads out the back of the quad, which is usually near your antennas. So make sure you have good separation between your antennas and your battery leads. Next thing I want to talk about is receiver selection. So once again, you probably don't need to upgrade your receiver to improve your skills and have fun, but receivers are a lot less expensive than transmitters. And if you're already in the market for a new receiver, you want to make sure you're getting a suitable feature set. The first feature you want to look for is diversity, which I briefly mentioned earlier. And diversity means that your receiver looks at multiple antennas independently, and then it picks whichever antenna has the best signal and it uses that antenna for your radio link. And then if that antenna all of a sudden has a worse signal than the other antenna, it will switch to the other antenna. You also want to make sure your receiver supports some sort of serial protocol between the receiver and the flight controller. So this allows the receiver to send all of the signals through a single wire very quickly and effectively. There is an older method of sending signals over one wire called CPPM that you definitely want to avoid, but most modern receivers are not going to be using this. You also definitely want to avoid using an aircraft style receiver like this, which has individual pins for like servos, and you don't want to have all this wire mess going to your flight controller when you could do it all with one wire. That being said, a lot of aircraft receivers like this do support one wire serial communication, so maybe read the manual on how to do that. They will be a little bit heavier, but you might be able to use it anyways. Now for my Spektrum users out there, I want to quickly cover some of the acronyms you'll see used. DSM and DSM2 are an older and technically outdated wireless protocol between your transmitter and receiver. DSMX is still old, but it's still the most current wireless protocol between your transmitter and receiver. And SRXL and SRXL2 are wired single wire communication protocols between the receiver and the flight controller. SRXL and SRXL2 also support telemetry, so your flight controller can send data to the receiver and then thus to your transmitter. I actually still use the older DSMX style receivers, but if you're going to be buying a new receiver, you might as well get the latest and greatest SRXL2. I also want to clarify that SRXL and SRXL2 only refer to the wired communication between the receiver and the flight controller. An SRXL or SRXL2 receiver is still going to be using DSMX between the transmitter and the receiver. So as far as I know, that means if you have even a super old transmitter that supports DSMX, there is no reason to go upgrade to a newer Spektrum transmitter in terms of the radio link, because the protocol is still the same. All right, now let's go ahead and see how to wire a receiver to a flight controller. All right, I have my satellite receiver wired up to my flight controller here. And yes, you can use just a satellite receiver as your drone receiver. I'll show you how to bind that up later. The wire colors, black is ground, orange is power, and gray is signal. So we have our black ground wire soldered to ground, obviously. We have our orange power wire soldered to 3.3 volts. So you want to pay attention to this. Some older satellite receivers can only take 3.3 volts, like the one I'm using here, whereas a lot of newer receivers have a wider input voltage range. So just make sure you are aware of what your specific receiver needs. Mine specifically needs 3.3, no more than that. And then gray is soldered, in my case, to an RX pad. For Spektrum receivers, you are pretty much never going to solder that to an S-bus pad. S-bus requires an inverter, whereas our Spektrum receivers do not require an inverter. So you usually have to use a different UART pad, such as this RX3 pad. For DSMX receivers, like this one, DSMX, you use the RX pad of a UART, but for SRXL and SRXL2, because it's a two-way communication protocol, you actually have to use the TX pad. So if this was an SRXL or SRXL2 receiver, I would have soldered this gray wire to the TX3 pad. But since it's a DSMX receiver, I've soldered it to the RX3 pad. So make sure you know not only the voltage of your receiver, but also, is it DSMX or is it SRXL or SRXL2? For Spektrum transmitters, you want to make sure your frame rate is set correctly before you bind to your receiver. So for my transmitter, this setting is under System Setup and then Frame Rate. So by default, this is set to 22 milliseconds. So every 22 milliseconds, your transmitter is going to send your inputs to the receiver. But you can actually change this to 11 milliseconds, which is twice as fast. So instead, your transmitter will send your controls to your receiver every 11 milliseconds, and that reduces your latency. And all you have to do is change this one setting. So make sure you change this setting before you bind to your receiver. All right, now we're gonna cover setting up your receiver in Betaflight. So first thing we need to do is make sure our firmware is up to date. So hold the boot button on your flight controller and plug it in to put it into DFU mode. You can see that Betaflight has picked that up, and we're going to click the update firmware button. We're gonna make sure we have the correct target. Before you flash the firmware, you need to make sure that you have the drop downs here correct. So your radio protocol for my Spektrum users out there, if you have the latest and greatest SRXL2, select that. If you have anything else, select Spektrum. And then for telemetry protocol, if you have SRXL or SRXL2, select that. If not, then you can just leave it blank. And then once you do that, you can load the firmware and click the flash button. Okay, so now we're done flashing. We're gonna go ahead and connect to our flight controller, apply the custom defaults, and we have to connect again after applying the custom defaults. So first thing we want to do is go to our ports and make sure we have our ports set up correctly. So you can see by default on our UART6, it has serial RX turned on, but I soldered my receiver to UART3, so we actually want to change that to UART3. And then make sure you hit save and reboot. Do not go to a different tab. We're gonna connect back up. Now we can go to our receiver tab and make sure our receiver mode is correct. So yes, we want serial via our UART port. And for our serial receiver provider, unless you're running a really old Spektrum transmitter, you want to either use Spektrum 2048/SRXL, or you're going to use Spektrum SRXL2 if you have an SRXL2 receiver. So in my case, I'm gonna go with Spektrum 2048/SRXL because I have a DSMX receiver. And if you have SRXL or SRXL2, then you want to turn on the telemetry switch here so that you get telemetry from your flight controller sent to your receiver and back to your transmitter. The next thing is the channel map. So you want to make sure this is just set to whichever matches your transmitter. So we're on Spektrum, so we're gonna click the Spektrum/Gropner/JR, which is TAER1234. And then again, we're not gonna go to another tab. We're gonna click save and reboot. We're gonna connect back up. So now that we have all that configured, we actually have to bind to our receiver. So for Spektrum, we have to go put the receiver in bind mode. If you have a bind button, just use that. Hold down the bind button, plug in your flight controller. You might have to plug in your battery depending on how it's wired up, and then just bind that way. It's way easier. But if you're like me and you've got an older receiver, such as a satellite, they don't have a bind button. So you actually are gonna go into the CLI and use commands here to bind your receiver. So we're going to type get Spektrum, and that's gonna show us these two parameters that we care about. So Spektrum_sat_bind is set to 0. That means it's not going to send a bind signal to the receiver. And then Spektrum sat bind auto reset is set to on. So if you had the Spektrum sat bind set to anything other than 0, the next time your flight controller boots up, it's going to reset that to 0 so that it doesn't send your receiver into bind mode. But we do want the receiver to send our satellite into bind mode. So we're going to type set Spektrum sat bind auto reset equal to off. Hit enter to apply that. And then we're going to set Spektrum sat bind equal to 9 for almost all cases. Sometimes it's different than 9. If you're having trouble, I'll leave a link in the description to an article that explains the different values. We're gonna hit enter to apply that, and then we're going to hit save. And then the next time we power cycle our flight controller, it should send the receiver into bind mode. So let's unplug it and plug it back in. And you can see we've got that flashing bind light. So now we'll go ahead and bind our transmitter. Okay. Slowly flashing, and now it's solid, so that means we're bound up. On the transmitter it said 11 milliseconds DSMX, so you want to make sure that still says 11 milliseconds so we can connect back to our flight controller, go back into the CLI, and then we're going to undo those commands. So if we hit get Spektrum, you can see our Spektrum sat bind is still equal to 9. We want to set that back to 0, and our Spektrum sat bind auto reset is still set to off. So now we're going to do set Spektrum sat bind auto reset back to on, and set Spektrum sat bind equal to 0. Hit save. And then just to make sure, I'm going to power cycle our flight controller here, and it should not go into bind mode. There we go. We have the solid light from the receiver. So we are good to go. We are bound up, and we can continue setting up our receiver. So we're gonna connect back up. Now we can go to our receiver tab, and if everything's set correctly, the quad should not be spinning around like crazy. And if we move the sticks, you can see the quad on the screen here is going to move around. Now this is where you want to check to make sure that your directions are correct. So for me, it looks like the roll and yaw are reversed. So you want to make sure you go in and change that before you take off. And then for your 4 main control channels, roll, pitch, yaw, and throttle, there's a couple things you want to do in your transmitter. The first is set your sub trims so that middle stick is as close to 1500 as you can get it. So now you can see I've centered all my sticks up, and I've messed with the sub trims, and I've gotten these as close as I can to 1500. That way when you are flying your quad, it's not going to slowly tilt in some direction or another. The next thing you want to do is make sure the ranges of our 4 channels are from 1000 to 2000. So for example, for the yaw here, I'm just holding full yaw stick, and then I'm increasing until I reach 2000. There we go. And I'm gonna go the other way and increase that until I get to 1000. There we go, and I'm gonna rinse and repeat for all of the channels. All right, so I finished up my adjustments. Mid stick is around 1500, and everything goes from about 1000 to about 2000 at full stick deflection. So now the quad should respond exactly as you expect. All right, the next setting I'm gonna show you guys is really important, so make sure you're taking notes. It is stick low threshold. So stick low threshold is basically looking at your throttle channel, and if your throttle channel value is above this number, it will not let the quad arm for safety reasons. So say you bump your transmitter, your throttle stick goes to 100%, it won't let you arm the quad and chop your fingies off. However, an interesting side effect of this stick low threshold is any throttle value below the stick low threshold, your motors will be at idle. If we've set up our transmitter so that our throttle minimum value is 999 in this case, from 999 to 1050, our motors are going to be idling, and that 5% of the throttle stick at the very bottom is going to do literally nothing. So it's a dead zone, and it takes away from your throttle resolution. So we actually want to lower the stick low threshold as low as possible without going below our minimum throttle value of 999. So I'm gonna set this to something like 1005. That way, if our endpoints drift a little bit, we can still arm the quad while getting back most of that lost throttle resolution at the bottom of the stick. The next set of parameters you should pay attention to are the RC smoothing parameters. You can really get into the weeds with manually tuning these, but for most people, you can just leave it on and leave these on auto, but you might want to change the auto factor right here. So basically, your outputs from your receiver are rather jagged, and the RC smoothing smooths them out because the control systems in your flight controller prefer that smooth input from your receiver. So RC smoothing does a great job smoothing out those inputs, but it also adds more latency. And if you're trying to reduce the latency of your control as much as possible, then you may want to try to reduce this auto factor value as much as you can without getting hot motors to get the most responsive feeling quad. So mess around with this, try to reduce it, and if you're not getting hot motors, then maybe just rock that low value. But if you do get hot motors, increase this value back up so you don't fry your quad. And once you've dialed all this in on the receiver tab, don't forget to hit save. And the very last thing to do is go over to the modes tab and make sure you have your arm switch set up. So just click add range under arm, and then just flick whatever switch you want. And then I want it to be armed in this range here, and then disarmed over in this range here. So super easy to set up. Once again, don't forget to hit save. And that is it for setting up your receiver. That is it for this video. I hope you guys learned something from it, and I hope I got across the point that you don't need to have the latest and greatest or spend a lot of money to have a well-performing setup. It just might take a little bit of extra time and resourcefulness to make sure your setup is dialed in. And at the end of the day, you really don't need anything fancy to be able to improve your skills and have a good time, which is what it's all about. With that said, if you did learn something from this video or enjoy it, make sure you like the video and subscribe. And this video was a little bit of extra work than usual, so maybe also give me a follow on Instagram at timmy.r.c. If you like these more informational tutorial type videos, let me know down in the comments and let me know what other topics you'd like to see on this kind of video in the future. Thanks for watching.